Okay, hello and welcome to the SHSMD Webinar, where marketing campaigns go to die in 4 seconds, what every marketer must know about their customers' first contacts. SHSMD would like to extend a sincere thank you to Mobius vendor partners for sponsoring today's webinar. This webinar is now being recorded and is broadcast in listen-only mode. We have allotted time at the end for Q&A, but feel free to click the chat icon in the lower right-hand side of your screen to submit questions or comments throughout the presentation. It is now my pleasure to hand it over to today's presenters, Bob Kobek, who is President of Mobius Vendor Partners, and Kris Baird, who is CEO of Baird Group. Bob and Kris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Kris Baird, and you're probably wondering about the title of this program today, where marketing campaigns go to die in 4 seconds. And really, it's about looking at the hard work that marketers do to get that consumer to reach out and make that first contact. But what we know is if you're not ready for market, bad things can happen in that very first 4 seconds that's going to take that customer and close the door on them and possibly even send them running to your competitors. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at some of the key drivers of consumer engagement, especially during that first phone encounter. And then we're going to look at some of the shifts that the market has experienced post-COVID and why specifically 38% of first-time callers say that they are not going to become your patient. They're not going to call back and they're not going to recommend. And then we're going to look at what are some of the things that marketing and operations can do to come together so that you make sure that you're able to convert that first-time caller into an actual patient. Bob?
Hi, Kris. Hi, Tom. Thanks a lot for the introduction. First of all, here's to hoping that everybody in Florida and Georgia are marked as safe from that nasty hurricane. My name is Bob Kobek. I'm the president and CEO of Mobius Vendor Partners. We're a business process consulting firm, and we are the designers of a feedback program called Patients Count and Employee Count, where we measure patient feedback. And the real joy that I have to be working with Kris here is that, first of all, Kris and I just met, and we've had great conversations about the tip of the spear, which is the contact center. So I've learned to listen very carefully to Kris. I'm looking forward to what you have to say, and I'm going to show you a couple of reports that will verify and help clear up some of the conceptions you may have.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And it's a pleasure. I'm honored that you'd invite me and sponsor not only this webinar, but also our presentation at the conference coming up in a week and a half. I'll be presenting there. Don't get confused though. The name of my presentation may sound very similar, but it's got very, very different content, and we're going to talk about that later. I am the president and CEO of the Baird Group. And when I tell people what my company does, I say, think of us as a magnifying glass, a mirror, and a map, because we do mystery shopping and culture assessments. That's the magnifying glass. The mirror is presenting, this is how your consumer sees you today, and then co-creating a roadmap to get you from where you are to where you need to be. So, and some of that includes customer service training and leadership development. I've been a member of SHSMD now for longer than I want to admit, because it was even before it was SHSMD, it was Ashkipper and another organization, and we came together. But I can count on one hand how many times I've missed a SHSMD conference in the last couple of decades. So if that gives you any indication of my knowledge of the organization and my loyalty to the organization. That's my history with SHSMD. And if you've ever attended a webinar or a workshop or even, a conference session with me, you're going to know that I believe that this isn't a spectator sport. I like to have group involvement. And so what you're going to see, and I want you to keep close to your keyboard and your mouse, because I'm going to be asking you to answer a couple of poll questions and invite you to put comments into the chat session as we go along. We appreciate the interaction, and it helps us just know more about who you are in the audience. So let's start out with a poll. We'd like to know what data are you collecting about that first phone encounter? So the poll is open. Please give us your responses. So a couple of the questions here or options are abandonment rate. Are you measuring how many people try and then quit in the process of reaching somebody? Wait time in queue, how long are they waiting? KPIs, like how much, and one example is the consumer effort score. And then lastly, I have no idea. You might not have any idea of what information is actually being collected. So a couple more seconds to put in your opinion, and let's hear from everybody. So abandonment rate, wait time, KPIs, I have no idea.
There's a difference too between collecting and measuring. The first two, Kris, as you know, are usually coming off the call center technology. That third one is coming from the voice of the patient.
Right.
So I noticed a couple of people have mentioned, yeah, they're measuring, they're collecting all the data. That's really good news.
Yes, that's awesome.
If you have no idea, that's also okay, because we're going to hopefully help you figure out what it is you're gonna.
Right, exactly. All right, let's close that poll. All right, look, so it looks like we've got, several of you who are saying, wait time and abandonment rate, but a significant number, over half of you, are saying that you don't have any idea. And a very small group are saying that KPI, such as consumer effort score, is something that you're measuring, but it's a pretty small number here. So thank you for that. Thank you for participating in that poll, because it helps us put a finger on the pulse of the group here and how we can maybe give you additional information that will help you look at what to measure and how to measure it moving forward.
So when we talk about key performance indicators, we're talking about those things, those items that are so important in your call center. And the ones that we're showing right now are pretty typical. And these are responses that are coming from a survey that are delivered, and it's delivered to the patient at the call center space. And so while you've got the machine telling you one thing about the abandon rate, there's an awful lot of information that happens if they're not abandoned or were they not in queue. So for instance, courtesy, initiative, listen, communication, knowledge, resolve questions. These are also, particularly like you could see where listening fell below a threshold. The threshold, it was a 7-point scale in this case. So the threshold was 6 or below, show me. And we came up with the listening score. That gives me a really good place to start to train. And I can actually drill down to that agent or to that person that took the phone call to find out who to train and what to train. The next slide, Kris. So for example, in this particular case, in this particular team, everybody in there needed to be working on their listening skills. So that tells me as a trainer, if I'm working in an enterprise-wide environment, which hopefully we all are starting to do that I know that I need to talk to my training group and say we need to work on listening skills inside. And I also see that in Frank Moriarty, there's some initiative that we need to work on him, and that is probably a result of his poor knowledge, because you can see he's got a very bad knowledge score. So he's bringing down the whole call center, all the scores based on the measurement that he took of several hundred phone calls.
You know, and that gets back, Bob, to you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? And so if I am calling for the very first time and I get Frank, right? What are the odds that I am ever going to really become one of your patients, right? What am I going to say about my encounters with that organization? And so what I tell people is two of the most dangerous words in healthcare are "it depends." And so when you look at the scores of all these individuals, it tells you, well, how is your encounter with this organization? And the answer really is, it depends. It depends which person you're getting when they answer the phone.
And nothing will kill a good marketing campaign quicker than Frank Moriarty.
Exactly, exactly. And so here is what is really the marketer's dilemma. I mean, many of you, if not everybody on this call, are in a position where you've created that strategic plan, you've got your marketing plan, you know what service lines are most important to the bottom line, to the success of the organization. And so you can put together the most brilliant targeted marketing campaign. But research shows that when you're in person, it only takes about 7 to 8 seconds to form a first impression. On the phone, it's really only 4 seconds. And that's where we got the name of this presentation, because you've done the work to create that great marketing campaign. You got the phone to ring, and what happens? So this is the dilemma. You've got your campaign, but do you really have a clear understanding of what that experience is like when that consumer, they're not your patient, the consumer reaches out to you? So do you have any idea what is the service they're experiencing? And that's what Bob just showed you, a great example of what they measure. We measure service as well with mystery shopping, but we're also looking at things like capacity. So are you ready to, do you have capacity? Are you scheduling appointments when people need them? So let's say, for instance, you know, part of your strategic plan is to, really elevate orthopedics. Okay. We know that it's a great revenue generator. So you've been charged with that great, making the great orthopedic campaign, and you put it out there. What's happening? What's happening when somebody does reach out to you? And what is the service experience? And then are they getting an appointment, right? And what is your staff's knowledge about that service line, about specific services? So staying with orthopedics, you know, if I call and say, listen, I wondered if you do this procedure, the small incision hip, does everybody know? We've been measuring in some of our research where, and one good example is neural. And we were doing an assessment of what is the consumer experience when somebody calls for neural information. And I remember specifically one study that we did where this organization was doing a very sophisticated procedure for seizure disorders. And so we had one of our mystery shoppers call and ask, do you do this procedure? And the very kind, courteous, very welcoming call attendant said, you know, we don't, but my neighbor's kid had the same thing. And they went to, and then she names the competitor. And so the caller was very thankful, right? But that attendant didn't know enough about that specific service line to capture that caller and get them into the system. Well-meaning, but it failed because she didn't really have the knowledge. And who's responsible for that? So when we look at what happens during that first phone call, we took an aggregate of 13,245 calls that we did to various practices in 32 markets across the United States. They were all first-time callers. And so we were looking at things like what is happening on that call that are either great satisfiers or dissatisfiers, and what elements of that encounter are most closely correlated to overall satisfaction. And here it's not the total score that we look at as overall satisfaction, it's whether or not they would call back and become a real patient, and whether or not they would recommend this practice to someone else based on this single encounter. And remember, today's world of consumerism, they are making decisions very quickly about whether or not you are what you say you are. So we did a white paper, and you're going to have access to this after the call, but pay attention to what some of the factors are that we revealed, because in this paper, in this research, we looked at all the entire aggregate, but then we also looked at pre-COVID, post-COVID, and looked at have the consumer expectations shifted in the last couple of years, you know, because we're not in the same world we were in a few years ago. And the last time we did this study was in 2016. And at that time, we were appalled to see that 35% of first-time callers say that they're not likely to call back. They're not likely to become your patient. But we were more appalled to see that since COVID, so in 2023, when we did this aggregate study of our mystery shoppers across the country, 38% say they're not likely to become your patient or recommend based on that single first phone call. So that's a 3% increase of what was abysmal before, is even more dire now, given that 38%. And I look at that number and I think, okay, think of all of the best brands out there. Best brands, whether they're healthcare or not, whether it's Coca-Cola or Apple or Starbucks, how many would say, oh, it's okay that 38% of the people who actually seek our services say they won't come back? It's not going to fly in any other industry, and we've got to be careful not to accept this in healthcare. So all I can say is when I think about that 38%, ouch. Any of you who are working on your marketing campaigns, it's painful to think that when the phone rings, when somebody reaches out to your organization, that 38% aren't going to ever become your patients. So I want to do another poll at this point. So quick quiz for everybody. I'm looking at 100% participation here. I would like to know, what do you think is the #1 driver of a caller's likelihood to return or recommend? What do you think is the most likely? Do you think it's appointment access? Do you think it's friendliness, empathy, being considerate of the caller's time, or knowledge? What do you think is the most closely correlated key driver to whether or not they would return?
This is a bit of a trick question too, because you're going to see in a minute what there is a direct correlation between the patient feedback and loyalty.
Okay, just another few seconds, but pick up your mouse, click on your thoughts here. What do you think it is? What do you think's most closely correlated? Is it the appointment? Is it friendliness? Is it empathy? Is it being considerate of the caller's time? Is it knowledge of the services and providers?
And keeping in mind that that first phone call really sets the tone for the entire rest of the patient journey. A good phone call makes them happier to go to the next step in that patient journey.
Okay, so what have we got here? Let's wrap it up. Let's close the poll. And what I've got here is friendliness came in as the #1 thing that you identify. Second was being considerate of the caller's time. And both of those things are correct. Appointment access came in third. And so thank you for putting in your votes here. All of the above are important, but not all are the most highly correlated. So Bob?
The most highly correlated, the customer effort score is actually a Gartner measurement. And all of our clients in the contact center space use the customer effort score because it is a real predictor of loyalty based on each transaction. So every time that an agent talks to a customer hoping to become a patient, the more convenient you've made it, the more likely they are to come back, the more likely they are to do business with you. We're all the same. Make it hard, I'm not coming back. And so the customer effort score is one of those things that would be really, really important. That is one of those things that's very important to ask because, again, that call center is the tip of the spear. Make it easy for people to do business with you, and they're going to continue to do business with you throughout their entire journey. Kris?
Bob, give some examples of what all goes into customer effort. So when you're defining customer effort, what are the things you're looking for?
Every one of the things in the poll, at a minimum, everything in there. If one of those things is off center, they're going to find it was inconvenient. If I have to repeat myself, if I'm not friendly, my transactional loyalty starts to dip. And the cool thing about the customer effort score when I talk about transactional is that it measures each agent. It's much like a net promoter score for the company. You could call this a net promoter score for that individual. So
yeah,
that's what brings it back.
And the nice thing about it with both of our assessment approaches is that you've got solid data to help coach people. It's not about, I gotcha, right? This isn't about saying, hey, Bob, you really stink at this, you're fired. It's saying, Bob, let's go back to the drawing board and take a look at some of the interpretation of how callers perceive you and what we can do to help coach you up so that you become one of our champions. So I think that's really important for marketers to recognize, is that oftentimes they're positioned at odds with operations. Marketing people are the champions of the brand, right? So you are trying to build up the reputation and you're trying to measure the voice of the consumer. the people in operations may not be tuned into your intentions when you come back with, wow, our net promoter score is only 53%, or our net promoter score is at a 5 out of 10. You want to make sure that your intention is properly presented to operations so that they partner with you in making improvements. It's not the I gotcha. It's data that's going to
there is a direct, I'm sorry, Kris, there is a direct relationship between the customer effort score and the net promoter score. And what's important, a customer effort score is a 7-point scale. And in that 7-point scale, obviously, the closer to 7 you are, the better off you are. And you'll see that increase when the customer effort score goes up, that 38% goes down.
So the things that we found in our analysis of the 13,000 plus calls is the things that were most closely correlated were considerate of the caller's time, right? So getting back to what Bob was saying, are you considerate? I mean, did you make this as easy for me as possible? Or was it clunky? Was I put on hold? Was I transferred without a warm transfer? We found that post-COVID, well, pre-COVID, the considerate of people's time, if the caller perceived that the attendant was considerate of their time, post-COVID, that number was 17 times more likely to return or become a patient or recommend if they perceived that you were considerate of their time. 17 times more likely. That's significant. Pre-COVID, it was 14%, and I thought that was big. 17% is even bigger. If they perceived you were friendly, if they perceived that you had empathy for their situation. Then there's appointment access. You know, everywhere we are doing research right now, we have people that are concerned about appointment access. And they should be, because appointment access is an issue across the country. But do you know what is the tipping point for the population that is picking up the phone, reaching out to you, trying to get an appointment? What's the tipping point? And we find it's different by specialty. But just for an example of appointment access, when it's less than 2 weeks, for primary care, they're much more likely to recommend and return. And we quantify it, and then we get the feelings. So we're always collecting the facts of the feelings. So we're looking at, okay, what's the tipping point on time? But what are they thinking as far as, was this better than I expected? Was it about what I expected, or was it worse than expected? And what we found was post-COVID, people's expectations have dropped, but they're not any happier with wait time. So keep that in mind. You need to know what access really is like. What is capacity? Capacity and access should be hand in hand, but it's not always, depending on what is happening in those practices. The sincere interest and whether or not they reached a live attendant. Those are things too that are very closely correlated with overall satisfaction. We talked about the digital front door. Absolutely. People, you know, the contact center, omni-channel. But reach a live attendant, if somebody is in there trying to get an appointment online and they're not successful, then they're calling, and every one of those people is expecting to reach a live attendant at that point.
So these are, going to Kris's point, this is a different type of measurement, measuring different ranks of issues that face a patient or a customer when they're making a phone call. So what you can do is you can start tracking and rating the values of each issue that you might have, that you might be facing, and you're facing them all. I mean, every day. Did that agent? Did I have a conflict? And if I did, what did I do to fix it? Did that agent have industry knowledge? If they did not, what did I do to fix it? Did they solve a problem? And you can see for each one of these, from the patient standpoint, which one was the most important? Where was the importance? And so conflict management was number one. Industry knowledge number two, leadership skills number three, and it doesn't change. The numbers stay the same, survey after survey after survey. And I would also point out, from industry to industry, they don't change. Hospitality, these rank the same in hospitality as they do in healthcare.
You know, and what I love about this, with you comparing industries, you know, healthcare, we kind of get in our own way. I talk about, you know, we've got terminal uniqueness. We want to believe that we are so different than any other industry, and yet we're talking constantly about the age of consumerism. And if we're really being honest, that this is a good example of, you know, consumerism. They're not comparing us to necessarily just other healthcare organizations. They're comparing us to hospitality. They're comparing us to finance, you know, or banking. So we've got to get real about what those expectations are, whether or not we're measuring the right things, and whether or not we're making use of the data that we are collecting in order to further the consumer experience.
And this is the statement that we've been trying to really demonstrate, as softly and gently as we possibly can. But I promise, measuring the employee experience is your guide to employee engagement, just as measuring your patient feedback leads to patient engagement. What that means is you're not going to engage that patient, and you're not going to engage your employee until you measure, ask them the question, what matters to them. And you would see a direct relationship between employee satisfaction and patient satisfaction, particularly in a call center. There is and you're looking for that disconnect between the two, and you find that disconnect by measuring both.
Exactly. And, you know, before I move on to the next point, to continue on with what Bob was just saying, I mean, it's been very well documented by Press Ganey and other people that are the big names in patient satisfaction, that you're not going to have great patient satisfaction unless you have great employee satisfaction. And one of the challenges that you run into, whether it's employee engagement or whether it's their skill set or the combination thereof, call centers typically have high turnover. And so you've got to work really hard to keep those employees engaged, make it a great work environment. And a lot of that, you know, may feel out of control of the marketer. But this is where I say, you know, there are things you know and things you don't know, but I encourage you to be curious, very, very curious about, okay, what is going on? What happens when that phone rings? What is the experience? And it better not be, it depends, because then you're really in trouble. But we've already proven that 38% are not likely to return. So ask yourselves, do I really have a handle on what is happening in our online encounter? So we've been talking a lot about contact center, okay? And with an emphasis on phones, but what we find in our research, when we give our mystery shoppers an assignment of a directed or an organic web search to find a specific specialty in a specific area, we're finding that oftentimes they're going so far in an online scheduling process only to get through multiple, you know, questions and be told you have to call for appointment availability. And, you know, when Bob's talking about that, that patient effort score or the consumer effort score, they've already exerted a lot of effort only to be told, go back to the starting block and call the organization. And as you know, the call center may not be open 24/7. And so that's a dissatisfier. So what are their perceptions right now of online scheduling? Are you really delivering what you say you're going to deliver? Because we find often, very often, that potential that the consumer gets so far, but then they have to go back to the drawing board. Or the healthcare organizations say, we offer online scheduling, and what they offer is online appointment requests. Or they get redirected because they've asked for a provider who is very popular and is booking out 6 months. Okay, so the other thing too is get in there and monitor perceptions of your chats. Chats are part of that omni-channel, and yet people know within so many seconds that they've got a bot. And when they get stuck in some loop, it is a major dissatisfier. And as Bob and I have been talking about, of course, you really want to dig deep into what is that phone experience and what can be done to improve that phone experience.
Are you saying, Kris, that AI is not the end all be all?
I think I am. I think it's a really wonderful tool, and we need to embrace it and use it. But if somebody is expecting information and they're not getting it, a major dissatisfier is when they get into one of these endless loops. And I don't know about you, but it drives me nuts. If I think, oh boy, this is really convenient. It's 10 o'clock at night and I can ask for a chat to talk to somebody, and then realize after about 15 seconds that it's a bot, and everything is canned and everything is directing me, to another information website or an article to read. And all I want is an answer to my question. When you look at the customer effort at that point, I'm having to do all the work and you're telling me that you've got a chat available. It's not really helping me.
Well, there are some really, really intelligent uses for AI in the patient experience measurement space. I mean, for instance, a smart survey, if you're using a survey system like ours, if you're smart, you're asking verbatim questions. And so somebody scores, let's take the customer effort score. They gave you a 3 and you drill down and say, why did you give me a 3? And you give that person the opportunity to tell you. From there, you can actually run that through an AI-based text analytics system and determine their sentiment and do sentiment analysis. So there are a lot of really smart behind the scenes uses for AI that the customer doesn't have to experience. And Kris, you're right. I mean, I just went through that with a large company with an order that I placed, and I don't know who to call. I mean, but I know this, I won't be doing business with them again.
Exactly. So the key thing here is seek to really understand what is happening with operations. So oftentimes when I get in to work with organizations, we've got these two silos. We've got marketing over here and operations over here. And we've got to partner. We've got to work on a relationship with them. So one of the bits of advice that I give to marketing is to get to know what is the reality that operations is dealing with. And let me give you an example. So many organizations call themselves a system, but there's not systemness. And one example of this is, okay, so I'm answering the phone, I'm trying to schedule all these people, but I've got a physician who says, I don't want to see a first-time patient with knee pain, during a full moon. I mean, I literally have seen 30 pages of exceptions to the template when people are trying to schedule for some of these physicians. Or let's say that you do have capacity in orthopedics. You've got 3 new orthos, but You've got an orthopedic surgeon who has been with the organization a long time. And what he or she is saying is, hey, if somebody calls and asks for me specifically, you don't send them to any of the partners. You don't send them to one of our other system practices. So if that kind of thing is happening in operations, that the people in the call centers, the people that are scheduling at the individual practice, if they're dealing with that kind of thing, you've got work to do in terms of creating more systemness and getting those physicians on board so that you're really meeting the need of the consumer, not the need of the provider. Okay, so I've seen it over and over again. So the other thing is, instead of operating in a silo, help share the goals for the service line. Help people to understand the importance of the role that they're playing. So when you say orthopedics is a service line that we're really targeting, we're going to elevate that with our campaigns over the next year, you're an important part of that. Make sure that they understand that importance of that first contact. Keep the people in operations engaged in the strategy. So often, marketing is operating in a silo, operations in a silo, and they don't feel valued. So get them engaged. Test, test, test. You've got to test what the experience really is like. Whether or not you hire a research firm, whether it's, a company like mine or Bob's, test the experience, know what it is really like, and be ready to talk to the providers or any other person who might be creating a barrier to access to that consumer experience. Make sure you're sharing the findings. And again, it's not an I gotcha. When you share the findings, it's not to point fingers. It's not to say you're bad and you need to fix this. It's about saying, hey, we're in this together. How can we make this better for our first-time callers? So I'm in California right now. I was doing a workshop yesterday, and one of the directors actually said, somebody called and was asking questions about their bill. And I said, I don't know that. That's the hospital. You're going to have to call them. Here's the number. Well, was that really patient-centered? You don't say no. You say, I'd be happy to help you get answers to your questions. I need to transfer you in order to do that. And I'm going to put you through to Jamie in finance at the hospital, and she's really good at what she does. So you're testing the experience, you're finding out where you have opportunities, you're sharing findings, you're building them up with training, and making them feel good about it, making them realize that they are a very important part of the marketing team, that they are the face of the brand. One of my favorite definitions of moments of truth is it's the moment when your patient decides if you are what you say you are. So this is where marketing is putting out those wonderful messages, trying to get people to bond, become loyal users of the service, of the brand. And if it all breaks down in the first 4 seconds, it's gone. So share the findings, share it, with the intention of this is for all of us to make it better for our patients, for the consumers to be more attractive, and then seek solutions for the benefit of the consumer. And as I'm not here to pick on the providers, but let's get real. There are so many times there are operational issues that have been in place for decades because that's what the provider prefers. We got to be ready to hold up that mirror and say, you say you want this, but this is the experience for the consumer. What can we do to make it better for the benefit of that consumer, to make it seamless, to make it, easy, so that even if it's just a 2-minute phone call, at the end of that call, you've got people who are saying, I'm not a patient now, but boy, I would go there because of the way I was treated. They seemed to care about me. They valued my time. They answered my questions. They were friendly in the process. So all of those things all add up to making that first positive consumer experience.
It's real important that the point that it says share the findings. One of the really most important things that we stress to our clients when we're building a survey for them is the enterprise nature of the data. The data that is used for marketing people is the same data that can be used in operations. You should be sharing those data. There should not be a silo when it comes to patient feedback and customer feedback. They should be shared. Now, there are some reports that maybe ops doesn't care about, but there is information that they should care about. And it's real important that in marketing that you, even when you're building your survey, we encourage our clients, if we're working with the marketing department, we encourage them to bring in somebody from operations when we're fashioning the questions to make sure that we're not going to step on anybody's toes, but to make sure that we're gathering data that will be helpful to them and to us. Because after all, we're getting our information from them and they're getting their information from us. So we might as well share it up front.
Yeah, and having them be part of the design, right?
Absolutely.
So that if there's something, let's say I'm the manager of that contact center, I may say, hey, look, we've been working on this particular thing for the last 6 months. I want to make sure that we're measuring this aspect. And that's something we run into all the time where people train on specific standards of behavior and then they don't ever test them. And so part of what we like to do is say, hey, what do you want? In addition to these things, what else should we measure? And they'll tell us, they'll say, we have this standard greeting, we have this standard closure. It's expected 100% of the time. And we're able to measure, did they do it? Not only did they do it, but then how did the caller feel about it? Right?
And the rule of thumb is do not ask a question unless you're prepared to do something about the answer. And so because they will find out, the customer knows whether or not you're asking a so what question. If you're not prepared to fix what they're telling you is broken, then it becomes a so what question and you're going to get so what answers.
Yep. You want so what, now what, right? So
right.
you want the so what, but then be ready with some solutions that, I mean, it's like one of these things that I remember seeing a poster one time and it said data everywhere and not a drop of information. And so I often find this where people say, oh my God, you know, when it comes to patient experience, we've got reams of data and we don't know what it really means in terms of what are the most important action steps we need to take. And that's what you want to make sure you get, you know, is that it's not just data, it's got to be actionable, not the so what, now what, right?
It's risky otherwise. I mean, and which gets us then to there's an adage in the call center business, and I've heard it for 40 years. The most expensive seat in a call center is the one that's empty. And the way you can minimize your turnover in a call center is by building programs around the measurement of the employee experience and the patient experience. You can't really manage it unless you measure it, which then brings you straight back into how do you fix what might be broken, either by individual, by pod, by group, by whatever. It's really important to remember that the first step you got to do is to find out what it is you can improve. What can you improve? And so is the customer information regularly disseminated throughout your organization? That gets to the enterprise nature of the feedback and the importance, the critical nature of sharing what you're getting, what your feedback is with your other groups. We have a lot of conversations with silos outside of our client silo with other groups inside of an organization to help them understand and help them analyze the data that we're collecting for them. So you've got to have that, those discussions, to Kris's point. You've got to talk to each other and you've got to share that data so that you can do something about it. And really, the big one is, can each employee explain how they are doing and how important they are to the organization? If they can't, then you have a culture issue, which leads to a whole other different question, different issue that needs to be fixed from the top down.
Yes,
Kris?
exactly. Oops, I'm going the wrong
We're
way.
getting towards the end, aren't we?
Yeah. So one of the things to keep in mind is, the readiness for market. We've worked with organizations in the past that say, we're not going to give any marketing dollars to any service line unless they have passed the test, so that we know when the phone rings or when they go online that you're actually getting a good experience. So we're looking at capacity. Number one, if you're rolling something out, know what the capacity really is. What is the staff knowledge of the services that you're offering? Understand processes that might be creating pitfalls for the frontline staff. So one example I have is we had done the mystery shopping assessment. We knew what capacity was, but they weren't able to fill readily. And so when I asked, well, what about waiting lists? And the staff during their training said, we can't do that. Our technology won't allow it. And the manager said, yes, it does. And what happened was, with turnover, this person trained this person who trained this person who trained this person. And as it evolved, it was an issue of one person didn't know how to do it. And so they told the next person we weren't capable. So make sure, if you have, and I just put waiting lists in there as an example, if there's capability, make sure everybody knows how to use the technology, right? Soft skills, I don't even really like the term soft skill, because I think the customer service skills are so vital. I'm going to take that out of my vocabulary, but one of the things we teach is how to say no without saying no, right? There's an art to this. And just like the example I gave earlier from my training yesterday, when somebody says, no, I can't do that, but here's the number. Well, she started with, I can't, right? And instead of I can't, to start with, I would be happy to help solve this issue with you, right? So how to say no without saying no. And that's a skill that you want to be able to test over and over. And then offering alternatives. This is back to what I said earlier. Are you a system or not? And if you're a system, it means if Dr. Jones has capacity, but the caller has asked for Dr. Smith, is somebody saying, I'd be happy to help you schedule an appointment. Dr. Smith is booking out quite a ways. I could get you into Dr. Jones as soon as tomorrow. Okay, that might be music to their ears. But if the doctors say, if they ask for me, you're not allowed to, send them elsewhere, you're shooting yourselves in the foot. So we've left some time here for questions. I'd love to hear your questions.
So would I. I mean, from an operational standpoint in a call center, we have one client, Kris, in healthcare that where we're measuring their call center, and we're measuring all their key performance indicators. And what's interesting for us is that the people that operate the call center don't see any of the data. All that data is owned by the patient experience people. And I continually get frustrated by saying, why aren't you sharing that information with the people that are managing the call center? I mean, they can fix what's broken.
Exactly. Exactly. It's sharing it and having having a culture of feedback, having a culture of data sharing is very important. You know, don't keep it in the silo, but also, you know, be careful not to come at it with the I gotcha mentality. You know, a lot of people treat this data with carrot and stick kind of thing. So somebody just asked, you know, any suggestions to break down some of the internal silos?
I have one.
I would say it comes from sitting down at a table and recognizing you all have the same goal in mind, and that's success and to be great in consumer experience, right? And so operations talking about what is it they do and do well, and marketing talking about listening to the voice of the consumer and what you can learn, and collaborating on solutions. So marketing will shoot themselves in the foot if they come in and say, this is what you need to do. Instead saying, you know, we're asking questions to listen to the voice of the consumers. Here's what we've learned. What suggestions do you have? So bring them to the table, make them feel a partner in the solution rather than, you know, being told what to do and how to do it.
Well, we have a white paper that that addresses that issue specifically. So please reach out to me, and I'll be happy to send it to you. The title of it has to do with senior management and senior management CX guide. Oftentimes, it starts at the top. It starts at the suit level, the C level, and so and if the C level doesn't know what you mean by CX or PX or EX, or they don't know what it is that you're hoping to measure, they just sign off on the budget. They need to be educated, so they push it down and they push it across the silos.
Yep, exactly.
It usually starts at that level. That's a culture thing.
It is definitely a cultural thing, but one of the things we really advocate is when people talk about customer service training, they're usually talking about what the attendants learn. But one of our key approaches is before we even go to those frontline and do training, we train the managers because they're the ones that are going to be overhearing calls. And are they prepared to coach, mentor, model, manage, and even hire for the type of service behaviors that they are expecting? So
and you can train them, based on the same data that you would train anybody else in that organization.
yes, but the skill set is different. The skill set we're focusing on is I'm going to teach you, Bob, as the manager, I'm going to work with you on how to coach that person, right?
Correct.
You
Right.
can understand the skill set needed, but if you also don't have the skill set as a good coach, it's not going to fly. I want to get to this question. Somebody asked about accountability among team members as they hear each other's calls. I love this question. I ran a call center, an Ask a Nurse call center years ago. And one of my approaches was, I mean, we were mystery shopped as part of the franchise, right? And so we had that data coming in. But one of the things I did was I set up a peer review so that people were expected to monitor so many of their peers' calls and give feedback. So I wanted to create a culture of feedback. So one of the things I expected was, okay, Bob, you know, you're going to be reviewing Kris this month. Kris, you're going to be reviewing Tom. We want you to get a minimum of X number of calls, and then the two of you sit down and you talk about what you observed. And once you get that going, you have a better opportunity to help create that culture of feedback to where people aren't saying, you know, Bob, you're not the boss of me. You know, you want to create a culture where feedback is expected. If somebody's not living up to the standard, somebody's going to tell me. And hopefully I'm going to turn to you, Bob, and say, thank you. I didn't realize I was doing that. So we are just 1 minute from time. I don't know, Tom, if you had any other announcements that you needed to make, but I just quickly have one thing, and that is to remind you about the SHSMD connections coming up. And our presentation, the first phone call, where does marketing plan go to die in 4 seconds flat? Very different presentation there than here, because I have the honor of having the stage or sharing the stage with Carolyn Cook from MedStar, who's going to give you a fabulous case study on what they did, how they measured, what information they gleaned, and what results they were able to create as a result of having data and acting on data.